Yeah, call off hands-free, so let's hope it works. How are we doing?
How do we get rid of the screen?
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yes.
Okay, I will stop sharing. Stop sharing.
Okay, now. Picked the wrong one.
Got the voice.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. We're good.
All right.
Da-da-da.
Here we go.
Okay.
I think we're there.
I think so.
Yeah, that looks a little better. And how's the voice?
Perfect.
Sound is fine?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, geez. Okay.
I shall
You know, we
move
didn't-
on and let things get started then.
All right. You know, we didn't change any settings. It just, yeah.
That's technology for you.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, Christy, unless you need anything else, I'm going to go ahead and log off.
We're good to go. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Have a good one.
Are you going to record this on Adobe Connect?
I think
Okay, you can get started now, and I will let you get going.
All right, very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right after all these issues, and I'm afraid we're running into your break time. Is that right, Mike? Okay. Mike says such is life. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about a project that we had several years ago now here in Nebraska. I almost hate to think how long ago it was, where we utilized a program that we dubbed as, quote, FarmLink, where we were promoting conservation practices one-to-one. And in this case, it was primarily conservation buffers, which I'll define in a little bit. But I do think that this concept can be applicable to most any practice. Now, I think your previous speaker talked a little bit about designing extension programs and outreach programs. Well, this is more or less keying in or focusing in on one particular aspect of how I think that could be made even more successful. Give you a little bit of background. I'm Dave Shelton, Professor of Biological Systems Engineering and Extension Ag Engineer. I have a 50% research, 50% cooperative extension appointment. Have been with the University of Nebraska, I say almost forever. Actually been in the extension position now for about 35 years and 2 years before that on the campus. I'm located at a research and extension center about 120 miles directly north of Lincoln. Colleague that worked with me on this project was Rod Wilkie. Rod at that time was an extension project coordinator. He has since, about a year ago, moved into a role as an assistant extension educator working in one of the counties, primarily because funding for these grant-funded programs, well, as often happens, ran out. So a little bit of background. In one-to-one educational program or one-on-one contact, however you want to put it, is not by any means new or unique. For lots of years, that was a primary extension method. However, within the last probably 15 to 20 years, I think that's become less of an emphasis, where we as faculty and we as extension specialists have been basically told that we really don't have the budget or the time to spend a great deal of time doing one-to-one contact. But I do think that in certain circumstances that the one-to-one programming can be a very effective tool. Let me type something in the chat box just to make sure that we're all right here. Yeah, Mike, if you want to let me know that the sound and everything is all right, just to be sure. So what we had was a USDA Cooperative State Research, Education, and Extension Service, basically an arm of USDA, funded a project where our focus was to accelerate riparian buffer adoption, primarily to enhance water quality and farm income. And I'll diverge a little bit in a minute here about the farm income aspect of it because, particularly for you folks in the agroforestry, you may have a little bit of interest in this. Well, I don't believe I really have any slides on that. But, again, what we were looking at was a program where the overall objective of that project was to, if you will, foster the installation of conservation buffers primarily for water quality. And now I'm defining conservation buffers a little more broadly perhaps, or using it in a more generic term. For example, if we go with the NRCS definition of what they would often think of a conservation buffer, typically that would be a vegetated filter strip or a riparian forested buffer. We took that a little bit further when we talked about conservation buffers, and we were actually talking about the filter strips, the riparian forested buffers, grassed waterways, grass turn areas, conservation planting. So we took a broad approach to conservation buffer rather than just what we would think of as being stream side. In that program, what we had was really three components to that educational, or to that project. One was a multifaceted educational program with tours, demonstrations, meetings, etc. We also had a couple of demonstration sites, and then we had a peer-based outreach program. That's really where I want to focus, is that peer-based outreach program. That's what we called the FarmLink, where we essentially had decided to have farmers or other individuals in the community who were well respected, and I'll go through the list of some of the things that we look for in these advisors, as we call them. What we look for, but what we did was have them contact other farmers and landowners to promote conservation practice adoption. We were working primarily in the Shell Creek watershed, which is in northeast Nebraska, in parts of three counties, Boone, Platte, Madison, and Colfax counties. Shell Creek has a real history of being, if you will, averse, let's put it that way, averse to the adoption of conservation practices. It's a highly erodible watershed. Totally, there's about 300,000 acres or so in that watershed. We broke it down into 10 or so different sub-watersheds where we would focus for about a year and then move on. So this FarmLink program that we had ran for a couple of years and was focused in the 3 really sub-watersheds that you see on the Shell Creek map. As far as selecting the FarmLink advisors, or those who were actually going out and doing the one-to-one contacting, again, the first thing we looked for was a local farmer or a landowner. And we did consider those who were perhaps semi-retired, and one of the ones that we did select was semi-retired. He farmed in conjunction with his son, although his son did most of the farming. We also looked for individuals who owned land adjacent to Shell Creek or one of the tributary streams, primarily because we felt that that would give them more of a buy-in or more of a reason to be concerned about the water quality in Shell Creek. We also looked for those who had a well-kept farmstead, feeling that, you know, if they had a good-looking farm or good-looking farm place, again, they generally had more pride in their operation, and again, might have been more likely to have been more conservation-minded. In addition, we looked for those who were well-respected, recognized as a leader, often those who were serving on like a board of directors, or in our case, for example, a director of one of our local natural resources district, or again, someone who was well recognized by their peers and in the community as a leader. Again, a strong conservation ethic, so that we knew that they were really focused or had particular concerns about the water quality, soil and water quality in the watershed. Good communicator, and again, we needed someone who was going out and visiting, even though it was with peers or colleagues, that they would be visiting one-to-one. They needed to be able to visit well with their neighbors and other individuals. Again, someone that was motivated, outgoing. We really didn't want an introvert or that who was not particularly, positive and comfortable in meeting and talking to people. We ended up selecting 4 individuals. Primarily, they came from a watershed group that had been formed a few years earlier. Again, they basically met those criterion that we had laid out as far as the selection goes. The next step in the process was to provide those 4 individuals with training, generally what they were going to be needing to do when they visited their neighbors, what they needed to talk about, and what they needed to promote. The training was primarily conducted by us in Extension, University Extension. We also had NRCS, both from the local, the area offices, as well as the local, the district conservationists, as well as our natural resources district in that area, which is one that covers that entire watershed. Again, what we were talking about was, for one, we provided training to them on the benefits as well as some of the design basics of conservation buffers. We provided them information on what programs were available as far as rental or cost share, like for example, Continuous Conservation Reserve Program would be one. In addition, the NRDs, or our Nebraska Department of Agriculture, has what they call the Nebraska Buffer Strip Program. Again, both of those programs provide rental, if you will, land rental for conservation practices that are put on the land. We also provided them with information on what we term as sales techniques. Fortunately, Rod Wilkie, the project coordinator we had spent lots of years as a feed and a farm salesman, and so he was well versed on how to go about making a sale. And in fact, that turned out to be one of his big issues, because he was often upset because he couldn't, quote, close the deal that he was so used to doing with selling feed or other agricultural supplies. And conservation practices to him were nothing different than that, but it was a much harder sell to get those adopted. The farm visit process consisted of several different things that I think made a particular difference. One, that we required that these people visit their neighbors on farm, face to face, not in the local coffee shop, but on that producer's own farm under his or her own conditions, often sitting at the kitchen table. Scheduled in advance, not cold calls. We didn't want those advisors just dropping by and trying to make a pitch. We felt out of courtesy that those interviews and that needed to be scheduled by phone. Generally, they lasted about an hour and a half to 2 hours, 2.5 hours. We also required or asked that they be during off-peak periods, knowing how busy farmers are during harvest or planting. Again, trying to be as courteous as we could to those that were being called on. Some of the things in that farm visit content actually were, they discussed the different conservation practices, benefits of those practices, various options, what have you. One of the things that I think was pretty key to this, and this could work well for an agroforestry practice that you were trying to promote, was to actually take aerial photos of the farm or the farmstead and show where those practices could be utilized on that farm. Again, another thing that was discussed was, we talked about the government programs that used to help with installation, maintenance, land rental, what have you. One of the things that was a little bit different perhaps in this program is that we asked them to sign an intent form if they were interested or committed to the conservation practice installation. There was absolutely nothing binding about the intent form, but it was one other piece that seemed to, if you will, make more of a commitment on the part of the person that was being visited with. And I think that once they signed it, they may have felt a little bit guilty if they didn't follow through. We did not, or we were not able to, or they were not able to, the advisors were not able to do the actual signing of the contract, so the landowner had to personally visit their local NRCS office to actually develop and to sign the contract. They were paid, the advisors were paid, and I kind of minimally actually, I think, but first of all, we made it clear that they were not a university employee, that they were basically on their own. We paid them $30 per farm visit. We also reimbursed them on the order of about 30 cents per mile. Now, remember, this was about 10 years ago, so mileage rates have gone up, but even then, I believe it was somewhat below the federal mileage rate. We did provide them, or did give them, if you will, a bonus if that landowner actually did sign a practice installation contract with NRCS or the Farm Service Agency. The project coordinator, Rod, in this case, Rod Wilkie, served a real key role, I think. Primarily, he was responsible for really locating, interviewing, and screening those advisors that we ended up selecting. He assisted very much with the training. He did provide or did serve as somewhat as a supervisor for those advisors and answered routine questions that they might have about virtually anything, either practice design or programs or what have you. He processed the claims that they submitted for their payment. He served as a liaison with NRCS, where he actually took the signed intent forms from the advisor who had gotten them from the landowner and took them to the NRCS office, again, so they had a record of what went on and that, and then it served to do some follow-up on the progress of what took place, following up both with NRCS and with the landowner. He also would periodically contact the landowners if they had not, done that final follow-up, to go into the NRCS office to establish the contact, or to finalize their contract, their conservation practice contract. He also would answer questions that the landowners had and that. Again, I think a really key role, and so you do need someone in that role, and you need someone who really can handle all these many different aspects. From that program, which I said lasted about a year and a half, some of the accomplishments that we had, there were 42 individuals that were contacted by those 4 advisors. As you quick math, roughly 10 individuals contacted by each one. Now, that was the average. We had 1 really outstanding advisor and 3 that were so-so. The outstanding one made about roughly 25 or so of those 42 contacts. So he was the predominant one. Probably the least performing one, I think, only contacted like 3 individuals, something on that order. So again, a whole gamut of actual performance by the advisors. 28 of those individuals signed an intent form. Again, nothing binding, but it was a commitment or that. We actually, from those, executed 16 specific contracts for a total of roughly 61 acres of buffers, broken down primarily to be 20 acres of grassed waterways, again, controlling a runoff from a little over 200 acres. We had about 41 acres of streamside buffers, and that was just, I think there was 1 riparian forested buffer of about 5 acres. The other were vegetated filter strips, and a roughly 12,000 feet of stream bank is how long that was. What that resulted in to that watershed, the CCRP payments and cost share and that were on the order a little over $73,000, almost $74,000 of over the life of the contracts, most of those being on the order of about 10-year contracts. In addition, and this was the one advisor who was the most proactive in visiting on his own farm. He also installed a little over 10 acres of buffers, again, primarily because of information he had learned in the training session. Those were broken down to be a little over an acre of grassed waterways, about 4.5 acres of streamside buffer, roughly a mile of buffer on the adjacent to the stream, 5 acres of cropland that he really just turned over or planted to grass. Primarily it was highly erodible land, steep slopes, and he established that for wildlife habitat and that. For him, it was around $10,000 of payments over the life of the contract. So some of the things, and I've alluded to a couple of these already, but some of the issues that we came up with, that we had during that, unfortunately, the NRCS Field Office personnel often didn't follow up as well as we would have liked to have had with those landowners who had expressed an interest. Obviously, the local NRCS has numerous other programs, and even though we would have liked to have had them drop everything to promote this program, it didn't happen. They're doing training, they're doing other programs, and so sometimes these got pushed to the back. We were also told by NRCS Field Office personnel that on-farm visits were potentially being, or viewed as being potentially discriminatory to those that they were not visiting, and so they were really often reluctant to make that farm visit. Alluded to this before, again, some of the advisors were better than others. Some were very, very busy with their operations, and as we subsequently discovered, one or two of them were probably not as nearly as committed to conservation as we would have liked. It was a case of perhaps, you as my neighbor, please do it, but I'm not necessarily going to do it on my own farm. And that can be a real issue and a real credibility problem. The CCRP, Conservation Reserve Program rental payments, their rental payments certainly have not kept pace with cash rents, what they were then and particularly what they are now. There was no differential offered for irrigated land, and about half of the Shelf Creek watershed is irrigated. So that's one difference between the CCRP program and the Nebraska Buffer Strip program that I mentioned earlier. There is a differential in the Nebraska Buffer Strip program. It's about twice the rental rate if the land is irrigated as compared to rain-fed or dry land. So again, but that was an issue with the irrigated land in the area. Some of the reasons that I think this worked, one was it did provide individualized attention to those that were being contacted. You were able to, or they were able to learn about different practices, different options, and one of the things that we found was that many of them, in all honesty, were not aware of many of the government programs that are available for conservation practices. And so just that in itself was a good way to create an awareness of what was available out there as far as practices go and payment goes. The initial contact is with a neighbor, not an agency. I think that made a difference. We eventually did have the project coordinator do some of these follow-up calls or make some of the contacts with other landowners, and he said that he did notice a difference in the attitude or the reception that he received when he was driving his own pickup as opposed to when he was driving an agency pickup, either university or NRCS. So again, I think that with the FarmLink advisors, that was basically a neighbor to neighbor and not an agency to a landowner contact. Generally, they were very personable, knowledgeable, highly knowledgeable advisors that were known in the community, and generally they were conservation advocates, although in some cases we would have liked to have a little more. And I think that it also, rather than just promoting an awareness of the conservation practice, that intent form implied some commitment, even though it was not binding. It did imply a commitment on the part of the landowner to go ahead and install that conservation practice that he or she said that they were interested in doing. And I do think that also there was some feelings of guilt, if you will. It's kind of hard to tell a friend, a neighbor, no, I'm not interested in a conservation practice. I don't care about this watershed. I'm not going to do that. So again, I think that can make a difference in selling a practice. So in summary, I do think that one-to-one information delivery, one-to-one visits can be highly effective and that. And I think that this can be adapted to a variety of different situations. Again, in our case, we were promoting conservation buffers or conservation practices like that. I think virtually all of the agroforestry practices fall into that conservation practice category, and so I think that it could be a very effective means of promoting or selling, if you will, agroforestry or other conservation practices. One of the quotes that we got from one of the Shell Creek landowners, while talking to one of the advisors, got feedback there, was that he felt that he had gotten more information in that hour and a half than he ever could have gotten at the USDA Service Center directly. So I think that was quite a compliment to what was being promoted and how this was being sold. So that's a very brief overview of our project. Questions, and there's my contact information. Finally give you a chance to see who you've been listening to and actually where I'm located. So, Mike, how do we want to handle questions?
Any questions for David?
I've got a two-part question. One is, how important does he feel like was the money for the advisors? And the second part, what is, did the advisors have transparency with their meetings to let the people know that they were being paid to have this meeting?
How important was the money to the advisors?
Yeah, for them taking part in this.
And the second part was...
The second
Great
part was
question. How
transparency.
important was the money paid to the advisors for them to take part? For the most part, not at all. We had, we often had to persuade them, if you will, to submit their expenses. Some of them never did, so no, I don't think that was a key thing. Obviously there were, I think maybe it was more of a, how do I want to put this? They knew it was there if they wanted to, so it was not like we were asking them to do this for free, but when it actually came down to collecting or submitting their expenses, I don't think it made much of a difference to them.
Your second part?
Was there transparency in the actual meetings that they were being paid by the...
Did the landowner know they were getting paid for coming to visit?
You got it.
The closing deal.
Question, was there transparency in the meetings? Did the landowner know that the advisor was paid to come to the meeting? Yes, I believe they did. That's a good question, though, and you raise it. I honestly can't speak to that with 100% assurity, but I think that I'm pretty sure that we did send out to the watershed an explanatory letter of the overall program to the landowners in those subwatersheds, saying that they would likely be contacted by the advisor and this was going on. So I think they were, but I can't honestly answer that with 100% assurity.
Follow up to that is, did they know that the guy would get more money if they signed up?
I'm going to guess that the answer is yes, but let's see what he says to this. I want to know if he would like to have been able to continue the FarmLink.
Question is, would you have like to have been able to expand and continue the program? Yes, we would have. We ended up actually doing some of the same, as I said, with Rod Wilkie, the advisor in that program, when we expanded to different areas of the watershed. The original grant that we were on ran out, and we had another grant, an EPA Section 319 education grant in that watershed, and we actually expanded the practices that we were promoting, and instead of the FarmLink advisors, the peer-to-peer, we did do a fair amount of the one-to-one contact with Rod. Did that, our project coordinator. But again, I think that he was an ideal individual for that because he had a great deal of rapport with the farmers. He would often drive his own pickup rather than a government pickup. And so, yes, I think it was very effective. And yes, we would have liked to expand it. We did, to some extent, use the one-to-one concept, but again, it was not necessarily with the advisors per se. Did the landowners know that the advisor would be paid if they signed up? Again, my answer is the same as before. That's a really good question, and I can't answer it with 100% surety that they did, but I think they did.
Did they cut anybody that wanted to be an advisor through the interview process?
Question is, did you cut anyone who applied to be an advisor via the interview process? In all honesty, it was difficult. We had to twist arms to get people to, quote, apply to be an advisor. So, no, we really did not cut anyone. We had to twist arms to get them to be that. Again, even though most part they were outgoing, comfortable people, comfortable speaking with others, there was a reluctance to, in some cases, to take this on. Again, expressing concern that it was going to interfere with their own operations and that. So, no, we did not, in that interview process, primarily because I think Rod had done a good screening of potential people to ask beforehand, so it was not really an open-ended application that they actually applied to be it. It was more a case of we contacted them and asked them if they would be interested.
Any more questions?
Tell them we're clapping.
I take it that must be about the end of the questions. So I do appreciate this opportunity, and I thank you very much. And again, you have my contact information. If any questions develop afterwards, as you begin to think about it, drop me an email, give me a call, what have you. I believe, Mike, did you include, or are you including both a copy of the PowerPoint and a copy of that Agroforestry Journal article that I sent? Okay, great. Yeah, the article that I referred to is several years ago. We had a descriptive article that appeared in Agroforestry Journal, 2004 or 6, I can't remember for sure. I have sent the PDF to Mike and asked him to perhaps copy that and distribute it to the attendees. That has a lot more of the details and some of the finer points and some of the other things, a lot of what I've talked about. But again, as you read that, if you have questions, again, drop me an email, give me a call, what have you. So again, if that's it, thank you very much.
There we go, ice cream.
This was designed to connect with what you just talked about with Yomi. And my understanding from knowing Scott Josiah is that this FarmLink program had its derivation in Projet Payvois, which was a project that the Pan American Development Foundation did in Haiti in the 80s and into the 90s, where they had regional training staff working with members in the community that they called animateurs, extension folks. And those individuals who were trained in the region, then they were the ones in the community to demonstrate agroforestry and then to do outreach within their community, so they were known, trusted, they lived there, they lived it. And I know that the amount of agroforestry tree planting that went on in Projet Payvois vastly exceeded. It was like one of USAID's most successful ever planting programs. Most of them were fairly dismal failures all over the planet. And this one was not. This one had a very high success rate. Part of that was because the link to the community was not through, it wasn't neither through an expat like myself, who would be a Peace Corps volunteer, or a long-term person working in country, or even somebody that was from Port-au-Prince coming to a rural area, but it was one of their own peers who was living in the community, working with their own peers, and that was the interface. And so they seemed to have tremendous, and they gave them really good infrastructure support. They put the thing together well designed. They didn't try to do too many things, but I think Scott Josiah in the background of this project had the idea of trying the same sort of one-on-one thing to spin it out into FarmLink. That's my understanding of the derivation of the whole thing. The question is this really, I mean, conceptually, to me, this is really a good way to go. People always seem to respond better face-to-face, right? What I learned when I tried to hitchhike in 1973 from Michigan to Oregon was not to stick my thumb out on the roadside, but I went to the rest areas with the truck stops, and I walked up to people with a little sign that said, "First, I'm trying to get to Denver." And it's much harder for someone to say no to your face, you know, versus going by at 75 miles an hour and you're doing this, and who are you, and you're going to stab me or something. So the whole peer-to-peer thing works a lot better. And I think in all circumstances, just like this, they said there's some peer pressure. You're sitting there, it's your neighbor. You don't care about the water. You don't care about our children. You don't care about our future. You don't? Really? You kidding me? No, that's a lot of pressure. It's a good pressure, I think. But the question is it, can we do it? I think it does work, but can we actually make it work? Can we actually make it work at scale? It seems to me agroforestry is so one-on-one that we need something that's very one-on-one. You know, I mean, to me, in the perfect world, we work with individuals who work with landowners, but then we have to find the key landowners who do the FarmLink.
One of the discussions that the state forestry agencies have had in the last 10 years is that the woodland ownership pattern tends to get more and more fragmented as ag land is getting more conglomerated, and that state agencies are getting smaller and smaller. So you've got a base of landowners to contact is getting larger, the base of people to contact is getting smaller, and so they're starting to go to programs that are group planning, that are web-based, and very much less personal, and they just keep getting less personal, and something like this has the potential to increase the number of faces making the one-to-one, because all the rest of the research out there shows that people adopt change through face-to-face contact. And yet we're shifting all of our program delivery to this stuff.
We're broke, not because we want to. We're broke.
I think was that a broken market? Is that what Goski called it?
Market failure.
Market failure, yeah.
In Pennsylvania, we have a peer-to-peer program for forest landowners. It's similar to the Master Gardening program. So you go through a certain amount of training, and then you have a commitment to 40 hours of outreach in the course of a year. I don't know if other states do that as well.
We do in Missouri, and we have a Master Naturalist program too.
Yeah, a lot of
I've
states.
involved a group down by the Ozarks in doing some controlled burns on several projects. They love it. I like having extra hands on deck. And,
Those kind of programs actually do seem incredibly effective. The stream team people, master gardeners, those do seem to be, I mean, that's a ton of volunteer hours, right? It's a ton of people who really care. They do it because they care.
But maybe, you know, I work a lot with master naturalists in Nebraska, and maybe it's just me. It seems very obvious to me when I walk in the room at 30 years old, I drop the average age down quite a bit. I'd say the average age I would bet is 60 every time I walk in those rooms.
God forbid. Careful.
I'm just saying.
I know, I
Can't use those people at all.
You have to speak up, but.
I would say,
No,
I
your
would say
point.
this, you are correct, but we can't underestimate the resource that they offered to us in natural resource management too. One of the ladies down there who is stepping in as the president, she's retired, but she serves on lots of boards, including the bank board as an executive, a lot of executive boards. She said, I'd like to develop a formalized agreement with you in this property, which is right now private, but going to come to the university. She said, I'd love to have a formalized agreement with you all to kind of make this a more concrete investment for us and to acknowledge you all too. So, you know, but the groups that she interacts with offer a great opportunity to carry a message. Now, having said that, you know, it's tough, and it takes a lot of follow-up and a lot of commitment on our parts, in addition to everything else we do, right? So.
Well, there's a lot of people involved in those groups, a very large number of people. I mean, you said the Minnesota Master Naturalist, I involved in a group up in Minnesota, and there's a huge amount of people that are involved in that.
And one of his agreements that he had for his program was not to contact people when it was high harvest time. And in our culture, high harvest time is between 30 and 65 years old when you have two people working outside and raising two kids and all that. So, I mean, your major unused resources in our culture are teenagers and people above the age of 65. That's the people we need to have peer-to-peer.
Did you ever make it to Oregon?
Get stuck in
Oh,
Denver.
boy, that's a tough question.
Yeah, I did. I set chokers and pulled grain chain and learned that that was a rough life, but it was an interesting summer. I lived in Cottage Grove. I bought a car that made a Volkswagen Beetle look big. This is 73. I bought a 1969 Subaru 360, which was like a motorcycle with a shell over the top. And we drove it all the way back to Michigan, and I actually got a ticket in Nebraska because when I was just going over an overpass, I couldn't get up to the speed limit. And the police anyway, it was a good time. It was a good time.
So that means you didn't go over 40.
That was a lot of fun. Speed limit minimum was 45, and I couldn't make it.
Well, now it's 40, so you'd be good to go.
It was really fun. I'd go, every time I climbed the mountains, I'd pull on the shoulder, put on my emergency brakes, and creep up at 12 miles an hour, and then get to 65 miles an hour down there. You have to be young to drive that car from California to Michigan. And I was. Anything else on that, away from that topic, on the topic? So here's the plan. You already have your, we'll leave the group names up there. So not really so relevant for tomorrow. tomorrow morning, we'll have a little spread in here from 7:15 to about 10 to 8. Right shortly from now, we're going to go back toward Virginia Avenue Garage, and we're going to climb in 3 12, 15 passenger vans to go up to Dan Shepherd's. And we'll do this tomorrow morning. For those that don't want to actually come here, we're going to meet at 8 o'clock over by those same vans. Tomorrow will be a long day, just because when we get down to Ozark Forest Mushrooms and then over to Wordak, probably be into the early evening, and it's 2 hours and to the minute.
2 hours and 15 if we don't stop.
2 hours and 15 minutes from the time we're all done with everything in Wordak. So that'll be a late evening. The next morning, Thursday morning, again, we'll just meet. There'll be food here a little bit, coffee and juice if you want. We'll meet back at the vans Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, but the drive to Fred Martz's farm is about 20 minutes. So we'll spend, the morning there. We'll come back here, and then we'll start in groups, and we'll start to work on the design exercise, and that'll be really what we're doing on Thursday. Terry Durham will join us for lunch on Thursday, so we can pick his brain more about what we see in the elderberry tomorrow morning. Okay, so yes?
And if you guys want the handout for the Marks Farm, I have it back here. So just grab it. And I also have dividers, if those of you that are organization freaks on some dividers. I'm one of them, so you can take as many as you need.
Now, if you want, we can walk over to Buck's Ice Cream and then walk over to the vans if you'd like to do that. So we can do the following. We can take 10 minutes, meet back in here, cycle over to the ice cream place, cycle to the vans, and then we'll drive out to Dan Shepherd's. How does that sound?
About when would you like to be loading the van, in case we don't get
About
ice
4
cream?
o'clock.
Okay.
There's 3 vans right before you enter Virginia Avenue Garage on the east side. You'll see them colored. Caitlin, are any of the vans that we're taking not located there? Do we have to go up and get any of them?
Yeah, one of them, I can get it though.
Okay. So 4 o'clock we'll meet.